I watched from my car as they celebrated the groundbreaking ceremony. Cameras flashing, speeches flowing about divine providence and community generosity. The pastor held up a ceremonial shovel, beaming as he spoke about mysterious blessings and answered prayers. What they didn't know was that their anonymous benefactor was sitting 50 feet away in a beat-up Honda Civic, invisible as always. What they also didn't know was that in exactly 3 months, I would teach them the difference between faith and gratitude, between blessing and entitlement. Sometimes the most powerful sermons aren't preached from pulpits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Thompson, and for 37 years, I lived what most people would call an unremarkable life in Millbrook, Ohio. I worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing company, drove the same car for 15 years, and lived in a modest ranch house that my parents left me when they passed. I wasn't wealthy by anyone's standards, but I was careful with money in the way that people who grew up without much tend to be. After my mother died in 2018, I found myself completely alone for the first time in my life. I had never married, never had children, and the few cousins I had were scattered across different states, living their own busy lives. The silence in my house became overwhelming, especially on Sundays when the weight of solitude felt heaviest. That's when I started attending Millbrook Community Church, a small congregation that met in a rented space above Patterson's hardware store. The building was cramped, with folding chairs that squeaked every time someone shifted, and a sound system that crackled whenever the pastor raised his voice. But there was something genuine about the people there, something warm that drew me in during those early months of grief. Pastor James Morrison was young, maybe 35, with an earnest face and a way of speaking that made biblical stories feel immediate and relevant. His wife Sarah played piano, though the old upright instrument was so out of tune that hymns often sounded more like suggestions than songs. Their 2 children, Emma and Luke, would color quietly in the front row during services, occasionally dropping crayons that would roll across the uneven floor. The congregation was small, maybe 40 people, on a good Sunday. Mostly working-class families and elderly folks who had been attending various churches around town for decades. There was Helen Rodriguez, a widow who worked nights at the hospital and still made it to every service despite her exhaustion. The Kowalski family with their 4 young children, cramped into 2 folding chairs, because that's all the space allowed. Tom Bradley, a veteran who struggled with PTSD but found peace in the simple ritual of Sunday worship. These weren't people with money to spare, but they gave what they could. I watched week after week as they dropped crumpled bills and loose change into the collection basket, their faces reflecting both generosity and worry about their own stretched budgets. They were trying to raise funds for their own building, a dream that seemed increasingly impossible as rent costs kept rising, and their landlord grew more demanding about repairs they couldn't afford. I remember the Sunday when Pastor Morrison announced that Patterson's son was taking over the hardware business and needed the upstairs space for inventory. They had 4 months to find a new location or dissolve the congregation. I watched as people's faces fell, as couples exchanged worried glances, as Helen Rodriguez quietly wiped tears from her eyes. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea I never finished, thinking about community and belonging, about the way these people had welcomed me without question or expectation. I thought about my mother's life insurance policy, still sitting untouched in my savings account. I thought about the inheritance from my parents' house sale, money I had never needed because my simple lifestyle required so little. I had spent most of my adult life being invisible, the quiet woman in the corner who processed numbers and minded her own business. But for the first time in years, I felt connected to something larger than myself. These people weren't just my church family. They had become my only family. The next morning, I called my bank and asked about wire transfers. I researched real estate prices in Millbrook, looking at vacant lots and available buildings. I drove around town during my lunch breaks, taking notes on locations that might work for a small church. I wasn't making a rash decision. I was doing what I did best: organizing, planning, calculating. 3 weeks later, I found it. A beautiful piece of land on Maple Street, just 2 blocks from the elementary school, with mature oak trees and enough space for parking and future expansion. The price was $180,000, more money than I had ever imagined spending on anything, but still within reach of what my parents had left me. I made the offer through a real estate attorney, establishing a trust called Millbrook Faith Foundation to maintain complete anonymity. When the purchase went through, I had the attorney contact Pastor Morrison with a simple message. An anonymous donor wished to gift the land to Millbrook Community Church for the purpose of building their permanent home. The reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. Pastor Morrison wept openly during the announcement, calling it a miracle. The congregation erupted in cheers and spontaneous prayers of gratitude. People hugged each other, laughed, cried, and spent the entire service sharing their amazement at God's provision through a mysterious benefactor. But land was only the beginning. Building a church would require hundreds of thousands more dollars. Money that a 40-person congregation could never raise on their own. So I kept going. I liquidated my retirement accounts early, accepting the penalties, because this felt more important than my future comfort. I sold my mother's jewelry, my father's coin collection, anything of value that wouldn't be missed. Over the course of 18 months, I donated nearly $450,000 to the church building fund through the same anonymous trust. Each donation came with specific instructions. This money was to be used solely for construction, with any remaining funds to be held in reserve for maintenance and future needs. I researched contractors, reviewed building plans, and even suggested architectural modifications through my attorney, all while maintaining the illusion that these recommendations came from the mysterious donor. I watched every phase of construction from my car, parked at different locations around the site so as not to attract attention. I saw the foundation poured, the walls raised, the roof installed. I was there the day they delivered the beautiful wooden pews I had specially ordered from a craftsman in Pennsylvania. I watched them install the sound system, hang the cross above the altar, and plant the gardens that would bloom each spring. The dedication service was scheduled for a Sunday in October, and the entire community was invited. Local dignitaries would attend, other churches would send representatives, and Pastor Morrison had planned a special ceremony to honor their anonymous benefactor, even though my identity would remain unknown. I had imagined sitting in those handcrafted pews, surrounded by people whose lives I had quietly touched, finally worshiping in a space that felt permanent and sacred. I had pictured baptisms in the new baptistery, weddings beneath the stained glass windows I had selected, children's laughter echoing through fellowship halls built with my sacrifice. What I hadn't imagined was sitting in my car on that October morning, watching through the windows as the congregation I had loved and supported celebrated in a building I had given them, while I remained outside, uninvited to my own gift. But that part of the story was still 2 weeks away, and I didn't know yet how quickly gratitude could transform into entitlement, or how easily people could forget the source of their blessings when it became convenient to do so. I was still operating under the assumption that love, once given freely, would be recognized and valued. I was about to learn that sometimes the most generous hearts are also the most naive, and that not everyone who speaks of faith understands the difference between receiving grace and deserving it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The new Millbrook Community Church was everything I had envisioned and more. The sanctuary could seat 120 people comfortably, with soaring ceilings that made voices carry like whispered prayers. Natural light streamed through the stained glass windows I had commissioned from an artisan in Kentucky, casting rainbow patterns across the polished wooden floors during morning services. For the first 6 months after the dedication, everything felt perfect. Attendance grew as word spread about the beautiful new building. Young families began joining, drawn by the modern nursery and children's classrooms that I had insisted be included in the design. The parking lot I had designed to accommodate growth was actually being used to capacity most Sundays. Pastor Morrison's sermons seemed more confident now, delivered from a proper pulpit instead of a folding lectern. His voice carried clearly through the professional sound system, and Sarah's piano playing sounded heavenly on the new Steinway grand piano that had been my final anonymous gift. The children's choir performed on risers that could accommodate 20 voices instead of the 6 kids who used to sing from the cramped space above the hardware store. I continued my routine of arriving early and sitting in the same pew, third row from the back on the left side, where I could observe everything without drawing attention. I watched as Helen Rodriguez finally had a comfortable place to rest during services, instead of fighting with squeaky folding chairs. The Kowalski children spread out across an entire pew now, no longer cramped and fidgety. Tom Bradley seemed more at peace in the spacious environment, where sudden noises didn't echo harshly off concrete walls. But as autumn turned to winter, I began noticing subtle changes that made me uncomfortable. New members meant new voices in decision-making, and some of those voices carried assumptions I hadn't anticipated. The first incident was small but telling. During a congregational meeting in February, someone suggested upgrading the fellowship hall tables to match the quality of the sanctuary furniture. When longtime member Dorothy Chen mentioned that they should be grateful for what they had, a newer member named Jennifer Walsh laughed dismissively. "Dorothy, this isn't 1985, Jennifer said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We have standards to maintain now. People expect certain things when they see a facility like this. We can't serve coffee hour on card tables when everything else looks so professional." I watched Dorothy's face flush, as murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. This was a woman who had been setting up those card tables for 15 years, who had organized countless potluck dinners and funeral receptions with quiet dignity. Now she was being made to feel like her service was somehow inadequate because the setting had changed. Pastor Morrison nodded diplomatically. "I think what Jennifer means is that we want our hospitality to reflect the blessing we've received. Maybe we can look into fundraising for new furniture." Fundraising? For a congregation that 6 months earlier couldn't afford rent on a space above a hardware store, they were now talking about fundraising for aesthetic upgrades to a building that had cost nearly $500,000. The pattern continued over the following months. The youth group requested a renovation of their basement space, claiming it wasn't, quote, inspiring enough for modern teenagers. The women's Bible study group wanted new chairs for their classroom because the current ones didn't match the sanctuary decor. The church board began discussing hiring a part-time music director because Sarah Morrison, despite her dedication, lacked the formal training expected in a church of our caliber. Sarah Morrison, the woman who had played that tuneless upright piano with such joy, who had taught children's choir with patience and love, who had never missed a service in 10 years. Now her efforts were being measured against the grandeur of the space I had provided, and found wanting. I started paying closer attention to conversations before and after services. The shift in language was subtle but unmistakable. People who had once spoken of our little church family now referred to our congregation. Discussions that had once focused on serving the community now centered on maintaining our reputation and attracting quality families. The breaking point came during the spring board meeting, which I attended as a regular member. The topic was the annual community outreach budget, something the church had maintained even during their leanest years. Helen Rodriguez had coordinated a food drive for the local shelter every Thanksgiving, and Tom Bradley had organized volunteer teams to help elderly residents with yard work each spring. Board member Richard Hamilton, who had joined just 3 months after the dedication, presented a proposal to reallocate resources more strategically. "Look," he said, spreading financial documents across the conference table, "we're spending almost 15% of our budget on these community programs. That's money we could be investing in facility improvements, staff expansion, maybe even a building fund for future growth." "Future growth?" Pastor Morrison looked confused. "Richard, we just built this facility. It's designed to accommodate growth for at least the next 20 years. "James, you're thinking small," Richard replied with the confidence of someone who had never wondered where next month's rent would come from. "We have an opportunity here to become a real presence in this community, maybe even regionally. But that requires investment in excellence, not handouts to people who aren't even members." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. These handouts he was dismissing so casually were the very heart of what had drawn me to this congregation in the first place. The generosity that flowed outward, the hands-on service that made faith tangible in daily life. Helen Rodriguez, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, spoke up quietly. "Those people who aren't even members include families from our neighborhood, seniors who can't afford groceries, teenagers who need somewhere safe to go after school. This church has always been about serving others, not serving ourselves." "Helen, I respect your passion," Richard said in a tone that suggested exactly the opposite, "but sentiment doesn't pay for building maintenance. We have a responsibility to be good stewards of what we've been given. What we've been given," as if the building had materialized through collective prayers instead of one person's life savings. Jennifer Walsh nodded in agreement. "Richard's right. We need to think strategically about our mission. Are we a community center or are we a church? Because there's a difference." The vote was closer than I expected, but Richard's proposal passed. The community outreach budget was cut by 60%, with the savings redirected to a, quote, facility enhancement fund. Helen Rodriguez abstained from voting, her face reflecting a disappointment that went far deeper than budgetary disagreements. After the meeting, I lingered in the sanctuary, ostensibly reviewing song selections for the following Sunday. I watched as small groups formed in the fellowship hall, conversations that seemed to divide along invisible lines. Newer members clustered around Richard and Jennifer, discussing plans for elevating the church's profile. Longtime members gathered near Helen and Dorothy, their voices subdued, their body language suggesting defeat. Pastor Morrison stood somewhat apart from both groups, his expression troubled. I could see him wrestling with competing loyalties, the people who had sustained the church through difficult years, and the new members whose energy and resources could secure its future. He was a good man facing an impossible choice, trying to pastor two different visions of what the church should be. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the original architectural plans spread before me. I traced the lines of walls I had paid to build, rooms I had equipped, spaces I had designed for fellowship and worship and service. Every measurement represented a decision I had made, a vision I had funded, a future I had tried to create. The church I had built was meant to be a tool for the community I had fallen in love with. Instead, it was slowly transforming that community into something I no longer recognized. The very generosity that had made their dreams possible was being used to justify abandoning the values that had inspired those dreams in the first place. I thought about the anonymous donor clause in the trust documents, the legal framework that prevented anyone from ever learning my identity without my explicit consent. What had seemed like humility when I created it now felt like foresight. Because if they had known who had given them everything they now took for granted, I wondered if they would have treated my gifts with more respect, or if they would have simply found more sophisticated ways to push me aside. The woman who had believed in their gratitude was about to discover how quickly blessed people could become entitled people. And the woman who had given everything was about to learn what happened when generosity was mistaken for weakness. But that education was still months away, and I hadn't yet realized that some lessons can only be taught through loss. Summer arrived with the kind of heat that made the new church's air conditioning feel like a divine blessing. The building hummed efficiently, maintaining perfect comfort, while the old space above Patterson's hardware store would have been sweltering and unbearable. I found myself appreciating these small details more acutely now, perhaps because I was beginning to understand how quickly comfort could be taken for granted. The changes I had noticed in spring accelerated through the summer months. The church board had hired Bradley Patterson, ironically the son of their former landlord, as a part-time church administrator to handle what Richard Hamilton called the business side of ministry. Bradley was 28, fresh out of college with a business degree and ideas about optimizing church operations. His first initiative was implementing a new membership system. Everyone was required to fill out detailed forms including employment information, income ranges, and skill sets that could benefit the church. The stated purpose was better stewardship of our human resources, but the practical effect was creating visible categories of who was considered valuable and who wasn't. I watched Helen Rodriguez struggle with the employment section, having to write "retired" in a space that seemed designed for people with active careers and disposable income. Tom Bradley left the income section blank entirely, his jaw tight with the kind of tension that comes from being asked to justify your worth in dollars. The Kowalski family, overwhelmed with 4 young children and 2 minimum wage jobs, took weeks to complete their paperwork. When they finally submitted it, I overheard Jennifer Walsh commenting to another board member that some families require more pastoral investment than they contribute back to the community. The community. When had a congregation become a community in the exclusionary sense? When had the church I helped build become a place where people were evaluated for their return on investment? The answer became clear during the July board meeting, when Bradley Patterson presented his strategic growth plan. Armed with a PowerPoint presentation that looked like something from a corporate boardroom, he outlined his vision for Millbrook Community Church's future. "We're sitting on a tremendous asset," he began, gesturing toward charts and graphs projected on the wall. "This facility represents nearly $500,000 in value, but we're using it like a small rural church instead of the regional destination it could become." Regional destination. I remembered when their biggest aspiration was simply having their own building. Bradley's plan was comprehensive and ambitious. He proposed launching satellite programs, a contemporary worship service to attract younger demographics, a premium wedding venue business to generate revenue, corporate retreat packages that would utilize the fellowship hall during weekdays. Each proposal came with projected income figures and marketing strategies. "The beauty of this approach," Bradley continued, "is that it's all about leveraging our existing assets. We have the space, we have the location, we just need the vision to maximize our potential." Pastor Morrison raised a hesitant hand. "Bradley, this all sounds very professional, but I'm concerned about losing focus on our primary mission. We're a church, not a business." "James, with respect, that's exactly the kind of thinking that keeps churches small and struggling," Richard Hamilton interjected. "There's nothing spiritual about poverty. If God has blessed us with these resources, shouldn't we be maximizing their impact?" The theological gymnastics were impressive. God had blessed them through my anonymous trust fund. Therefore, they were obligated to monetize that blessing as efficiently as possible. The irony was so sharp it could have cut glass, but it was Jennifer Walsh's next comment that made my blood run cold. "I think we also need to be realistic about our congregation," she said, consulting notes on her tablet. "If we're going to attract the kind of families that can support this vision, we need to consider whether our current demographic mix is helping or hindering that goal." Demographic mix. She was talking about people like Helen Rodriguez and Tom Bradley and the Kowalski family as demographic problems to be solved. Chapa tapa. Dorothy Chen, who had been quiet through most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "Jennifer, are you suggesting that some of our members are less welcome than others?" "Of course not," Jennifer replied smoothly. "I'm simply saying that growth requires intentionality. We need to ask ourselves, what kind of church do we want to be? Do we want to be a social service organization, or do we want to be a thriving spiritual community that can actually afford to help people?" The false choice was breathtaking in its cruelty, as if caring for struggling community members was somehow incompatible with spiritual growth. As if the very people who had sustained this congregation through years of hardship were now obstacles to its success. The meeting ended without formal votes on Bradley's proposals, but the momentum was clearly building toward implementation. I left that evening feeling like I had watched something precious being dissected and reassembled into something unrecognizable. 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived in my mailbox. Or, rather, it didn't arrive. Awesomeness. I discovered the omission by accident. Helen Rodriguez called me on a Thursday evening, her voice excited despite her usual reserved demeanor. "Margaret, did you get your invitation to the anniversary celebration? I'm so looking forward to it, and I wanted to coordinate what we're bringing for the potluck." Anniversary celebration. I had no idea what she was talking about. "I'm not sure I received mine yet," I said carefully. "Could you tell me more about it?" "Oh, it's wonderful." Helen's enthusiasm was infectious. "They're having a special service to commemorate the first anniversary of our beautiful building. Pastor Morrison is giving a special sermon about God's provision, and they're inviting the whole community. The mayor is even supposed to speak about how much the church means to Millbrook." My chest tightened. A celebration of the building I had funded, and I hadn't been invited. "When is it scheduled?" I asked. "Sunday after next, at 3 in the afternoon. They're calling it a year of blessings, celebrating God's provision. The invitations are so elegant, professionally printed on heavy cardstock. They must have cost a fortune. A fortune paid for with money that could have gone to the community outreach programs they had cut." After I hung up with Helen, I sat very still in my living room, processing what I had learned. Every member of the congregation had received a formal invitation to celebrate the anniversary of a building they hadn't paid for, except for the person who had actually built it. It could have been an oversight, a mistake in the mailing list, but something in my gut told me it wasn't. I thought about the membership forms with their income requirements, about Bradley Patterson's demographic assessments, about Jennifer Walsh's comments regarding intentional growth. The next day, I drove past the church during my lunch break. A large banner hung across the front entrance, celebrating 1 year of God's abundant provision, community welcome. Below it, smaller text advertised tours of the facility and information about upcoming programs. I parked across the street and watched as people stopped to read the banner, some taking photos with their phones. A local newspaper reporter was interviewing Pastor Morrison on the front steps, probably preparing a human interest story about the miraculous church that had appeared through anonymous generosity. Anonymous generosity. The phrase that had once felt like humble stewardship now felt like convenient erasure. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I pulled out the original trust documents and reviewed every clause, every condition, every legal protection I had built into the arrangement. The building belonged to the church in perpetuity, but the trust maintained certain oversight privileges that I had never exercised. I also reviewed the deed to the land, which had a unique clause my attorney had insisted upon. If the church ever ceased to operate as a place of worship, serving the broader community, if it became something other than what it was intended to be, ownership could revert to the trust for redistribution to other charitable organizations. At the time, it had seemed like an unnecessary precaution. Now it felt like prescience. Bickaxe. I wasn't ready to take action yet. This could still be a misunderstanding, a clerical error, a test of my patience and forgiveness. But I was beginning to understand that sometimes the most generous act is teaching people the true cost of what they've been given for free. The anniversary celebration was 10 days away. I had 10 days to decide whether I would watch from the parking lot as they celebrated my gift without acknowledging my existence, or whether it was time for the anonymous donor to become a little less anonymous. 10 days to decide whether faith without gratitude deserved the same generosity as faith with reverence. The woman who had built their church was about to discover whether she was welcome in it. The morning of the anniversary celebration dawned clear and bright, the kind of September day that makes everything look crisp and purposeful. I woke early, made coffee, and sat at my kitchen table staring at the formal invitation that had never come. Instead, I held a printed copy of the church's website announcement that I had discovered 3 days earlier while researching their new programs. Join us for a special celebration of God's miraculous provision, the webpage read. 1 year ago, through the generosity of an anonymous benefactor, our dreams became reality. Come celebrate how far we've come and learn about our exciting future plans. How far we've come, as if the building had been a starting point rather than a destination. As if my life savings had been a down payment on something larger rather than a complete gift. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue dress and my mother's pearl necklace. Not because I planned to attend the celebration, but because I wanted to feel dignified while watching it from the outside. I had decided to drive by the church during the ceremony, perhaps park across the street and observe the community I had helped create as they celebrated without me. But as I applied lipstick in my bedroom mirror, something shifted. Why was I planning to hide in my car like some sort of spy? This was my church too. I had attended services there for over 2 years, I had participated in Bible studies, I had volunteered for committees. My absence from the invitation list didn't negate my membership or my right to be present. More importantly, I realized I needed to hear what they would say about the anonymous benefactor. I needed to understand how my story was being told, how my sacrifice was being framed, how my motivations were being interpreted by people who had never bothered to learn who I actually was. Helena. At 2:45 p.m., I walked through the front doors of Millbrook Community Church for what I didn't yet know would be the last time as a welcome guest. The sanctuary was packed beyond capacity. Folding chairs had been set up in the back and along the side aisles to accommodate the crowd. I recognized most of the longtime congregation members, but there were easily twice as many people I had never seen before. Local dignitaries, members of other churches, community leaders, and what appeared to be potential new members drawn by the publicity. I found a seat in the very back, on a folding chair that wobbled slightly on the uneven floor. The irony wasn't lost on me, sitting on unstable furniture in a building I had paid to construct perfectly. The service began with a processional of choir members, including several new faces wearing matching robes that I knew must have cost hundreds of dollars each. Sarah Morrison was notably absent from the piano bench, replaced by a younger woman whose bio in the program listed credentials from a prestigious music conservatory. Pastor Morrison took the pulpit with an energy I hadn't seen from him in months. His sermon text was from 1 Kings, the story of Solomon building the temple, and his message was titled, "When God Moves Mountains, Recognizing Divine Provision in Our Lives." 1 year ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the excellent sound system. This congregation was meeting in a cramped space above a hardware store, wondering if we would even have a place to worship. Today, we stand in a beautiful sanctuary that represents God's faithfulness and the generosity of His people. The generosity of His people. Plural. As if my individual sacrifice had been a collective effort. He continued for 20 minutes, weaving a narrative about faith, persistence, and divine timing. He spoke eloquently about how God had prepared an anonymous benefactor, a modern-day Good Samaritan, to provide exactly what the congregation needed at exactly the right moment. He described the mysterious donor as someone who had been moved by the Spirit to invest in kingdom work, and whose humble desire for anonymity reflected the purest form of Christian giving. It should have felt gratifying to hear my motives described so generously. Instead, I felt erased. The pastor was describing a symbolic figure, a theological plot device, not a real person with real reasons for caring about this specific community. He was speaking about me as if I were a character in a parable, rather than a woman sitting 30 feet away from him. But it was Mayor Patricia Hendricks who delivered the comment that changed everything. When Pastor Morrison first told me about this building project, she said during her remarks, "I have to admit I was skeptical. Small churches come and go, and I wasn't sure Millbrook Community Church had the staying power to justify this level of investment. But looking around today, seeing this thriving congregation, and learning about your ambitious growth plans, I can see that your anonymous donor was truly inspired. They obviously recognize something special here, the kind of dynamic, forward-thinking leadership that can make a real impact in our community." Dynamic, forward-thinking leadership. The mayor was crediting the current leadership team with inspiring my donation, as if I had researched their business plan and decided to invest in their vision. As if I hadn't been sitting in their cramped, rented space for months, getting to know them as people rather than evaluating them as leaders. Richard Hamilton followed the mayor to the microphone, and his comments were even more revealing. "This building represents more than just bricks and mortar," he said with practiced confidence. "It represents the faith that community leaders like our board and Pastor Morrison inspire in others. When someone makes a donation of this magnitude, they're not just giving money, they're investing in leadership they trust to multiply that gift's impact." Our anonymous benefactor clearly saw the potential in our vision for growth and excellence. Vision for growth and excellence. The vision that had driven out community outreach programs and made longtime members feel unwelcome. The vision that had turned my gift into a business plan. But it was Bradley Patterson who delivered the final blow to my remaining illusions. "I've had the privilege of researching similar anonymous donations to churches across the country," he announced. "And what consistently emerges is that these benefactors are successful business people who recognize effective leadership when they see it. They don't give to churches that are merely surviving. They invest in churches that are thriving, churches with clear strategic direction and measurable growth potential." The fact that we were chosen speaks volumes about what this congregation has accomplished under current leadership. Successful business people, strategic direction, measurable growth potential. I wasn't a grieving bookkeeper who had fallen in love with a kind community. I was a calculated investor who had conducted due diligence on their corporate structure. As Bradley spoke, I saw nods of agreement throughout the congregation. People were buying into this narrative, this complete rewriting of reality that transformed my emotional connection into a business transaction, my personal loss into market research, my sacrificial love into venture capital. I looked around the sanctuary at faces I had come to know over the past 2 years. Helen Rodriguez was clapping politely, but her expression seemed confused, as if she couldn't quite reconcile the strategic investor being described with the actual congregation she had experienced. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, perhaps recognizing that measurable growth potential didn't include veterans struggling with PTSD. The Kowalski family looked impressed but overwhelmed, like they were attending a celebration for an organization they no longer quite belonged to. Near the front of the sanctuary, Jennifer Walsh was beaming with satisfaction. This was the story she wanted told, the version that validated all the changes she had championed. If the donor had been a sophisticated investor rather than a lonely congregant, then treating the church like a business wasn't a betrayal of its mission. It was fulfilling the donor's original intent. The service concluded with a dedication ceremony for a bronze plaque that would be mounted in the church foyer. Pastor Morrison read the inscription aloud, in grateful recognition of God's provision through an anonymous benefactor whose vision and generosity made this sanctuary possible. May this building serve as a testament to faith, leadership, and the power of strategic stewardship. Strategic stewardship. They had managed to make even gratitude sound like a business principle. As people filed out of the sanctuary, chatting excitedly about the growth plans that had been outlined, I remained in my folding chair. I watched the crowd thin, observed the handshakes and congratulations being exchanged among the leadership team, listened to fragments of conversation about quarterly projections and demographic targeting. I sat there until the sanctuary was nearly empty, processing what I had just witnessed. They hadn't simply failed to invite me to the celebration. They had celebrated a completely fictional version of my story. They had replaced me with a character that justified their transformation from a community church into a corporate entity. The woman who had given everything to preserve their values had been reimagined as someone who had funded their abandonment of those values. The donor who had loved them exactly as they were had been recast as an investor who had seen their potential to become something else entirely. When I finally stood to leave, Pastor Morrison was standing at the back of the sanctuary, greeting the last few departing guests. He smiled at me with the same warmth he had always shown, apparently unaware that he had just spent an hour describing me as someone I had never been. "Margaret, I'm so glad you could make it," he said genuinely. "Wasn't it wonderful to hear how God has blessed our congregation?" I looked into his earnest face, this good man who had become so focused on managing competing interests that he had lost sight of simple truth. "It was very educational, Pastor Morrison. Very educational indeed." As I walked to my car, I realized that the invitation I had never received wasn't the real problem. The real problem was that they were celebrating the wrong story entirely. And for the first time since I had made my anonymous donations, I began to consider whether it might be time for the true story to be told. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with documents spread before me like evidence in a case I was finally ready to prosecute. The trust papers, the deed transfers, the construction contracts, the receipt for every single donation. Proof that the story they had celebrated that afternoon was a complete fabrication. But it wasn't anger that kept me awake. It was clarity. For months, I had been trying to convince myself that the changes I witnessed were growing pains, that the church would find its way back to its original heart. The anniversary celebration had shattered that illusion completely. They hadn't just forgotten me. They had actively rewritten history to erase the woman I actually was and replace her with someone who justified their new direction. My sacrificial love had been transformed into calculated investment. My humble anonymity had been reframed as sophisticated strategy. My desire to preserve their community values had been twisted into endorsement of their corporate ambitions. At 3 a.m., I made a decision. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to David Chen, the attorney who had originally handled the trust paperwork. David was Dorothy Chen's nephew, a quiet man in his 40s who specialized in nonprofit law and had donated his services during the original building project. David, I wrote, I need to schedule a meeting regarding the Millbrook Faith Foundation Trust. It's time to discuss exercising some of the oversight provisions we built into the original agreement. Specifically, I need to understand my options if the church has deviated significantly from its stated mission and community service mandate. I sent the email at 3:17 a.m. and received a response by 7:30 a.m. David could meet that afternoon. His brief reply included a line that made my pulse quicken. I've been wondering when this call would come. I've observed some concerning changes myself. When I arrived at David's office that afternoon, I found him already reviewing the trust documents. Dorothy's influence was evident in his demeanor. He had the same careful precision, the same quiet integrity that had made his aunt such a steady presence in the congregation. "Margaret," he said after I settled into the chair across from his desk, "I want you to know that what you're feeling isn't unusual. I've handled several cases where anonymous donors eventually felt that their gifts were being misused or misrepresented. I outlined everything I had observed: the cuts to community outreach, the emphasis on revenue generation, the membership categorization system, the exclusion from the anniversary celebration, and most importantly, the complete rewriting of my motivations and identity." David listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "The legal situation is actually quite straightforward," he finally said. "The trust agreement includes specific language about the church's obligation to serve the broader community and maintain its original mission. If they've substantially deviated from that mission, you have several options." He pulled out a highlighted copy of the trust documents and pointed to a section I had barely paid attention to when signing. "This clause here gives you the right to revoke the gift if the organization ceases to operate in accordance with its stated charitable purpose. The land deed has similar provisions. Technically, if you can demonstrate mission drift, you could reclaim both the building and the property." Reclaim the building. The possibility sent a shiver through me that was equal parts fear and excitement. "But," David continued, "there's also a simpler option. The trust language requires that your identity as the donor remain confidential only as long as you choose to maintain that confidentiality. You have the absolute right to reveal yourself at any time, and once you do, the church is legally obligated to acknowledge your role in all future communications about the building project." I thought about the bronze plaque in the foyer, about the anniversary celebration narrative, about Richard Hamilton's speech crediting their leadership with inspiring my donation. "What would that look like practically?" I asked. "You could request a congregational meeting, reveal your identity, and require them to publicly acknowledge the true source and motivation of their building fund. You could also demand representation on the board of directors, commensurate with your contribution. Essentially, you could force them to confront the reality that their entire institutional narrative is built on a foundation of lies." The word lies hung in the air between us. That's what it was, really. Not misunderstanding, not misinterpretation, but deliberate deception designed to serve their current agenda. "There's one more thing," David added, consulting his notes. "I attended the anniversary celebration yesterday. My aunt insisted I come to see how beautiful the building had turned out. I heard the speeches." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Margaret, what they described wasn't just factually incorrect, it was legally problematic. By claiming that your donation was motivated by their strategic vision and leadership capabilities, they're essentially engaging in fraudulent fundraising. They're telling potential new donors that sophisticated investors have validated their approach, when in reality, their major donor gave money to support the exact opposite of what they're now doing." Fraudulent fundraising. I hadn't considered that angle, but David was right. Anyone who donated money based on the story told at the anniversary celebration would be giving under false pretenses. "What do you recommend?" I asked. David leaned back in his chair, studying my face with the same careful attention he had given the legal documents. "Honestly, I think you should confront them directly, not with lawyers or legal threats, but with truth. Give them an opportunity to correct course before you exercise any of your more dramatic options. Some of these people are good people who have gotten caught up in something they don't fully understand." I thought about Pastor Morrison's genuine smile, About Helen Rodriguez's continued kindness. About the families like the Kowalskis who were being pushed to the margins but hadn't chosen to leave. How would I do that? Request a special congregational meeting. Reveal your identity. Tell your real story. Give them a chance to hear who you actually are and why you actually gave. See if truth has any power to change their direction. David pulled out a sample letter format on his computer. This is what a formal request would look like. You have the right as a member to call for a special meeting if you have concerns about the church's direction. You don't have to reveal your identity in the initial request. You can save that for the actual meeting. As he printed the template, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not hope that everything would return to exactly as it was before, but hope that truth might still matter to at least some of the people I had cared about. One more thing, David said as he handed me the papers. Whatever you decide to do, you need to be prepared for all possible outcomes. Some people might be genuinely grateful to finally know who you are, and to understand your real motivations. Others might feel embarrassed or defensive about the false narrative they've been promoting. And some might resent you for disrupting their plans. I folded the papers and put them in my purse. David, I've spent 2 years watching them take credit for something I gave, and yesterday I watched them celebrate a completely fictional version of my life. I think I can handle some resentment. He smiled, the same gentle, knowing expression I had seen on his aunt's face countless times. I think you can too. But Margaret, remember that once you reveal yourself, you can't go back to being anonymous. This will change everything. Not just for them, but for you. I drove home slowly that afternoon, taking the long route past the church. The building looked exactly the same as always, beautiful and solid and permanent. But I saw it differently now, not as a gift I had given and lost control of, but as a trust I had established and had the right to oversee. The bronze plaque was visible through the glass doors of the foyer, gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of making sure that plaque told the truth. And if they weren't interested in truth, I would have to consider whether a building founded on lies deserved to continue standing. The woman who had given everything anonymously was about to discover what happened when she stepped out of the shadows and demanded to be seen, not as a strategic investor or a theological plot device, but as Margaret Thompson, bookkeeper, congregant, and the person who had believed in them enough to give them everything. Whether they deserved that belief was about to be tested. I spent 3 days crafting the letter that would request a special congregational meeting. Each draft felt either too accusatory or too passive, too emotional or too clinical. I wanted to strike the right tone, serious enough to command attention, but not so inflammatory that people would dismiss it before hearing what I had to say. The final version was 2 pages, typed on my personal letterhead and signed with my full legal name. I hand-delivered it to Pastor Morrison's office on a Thursday morning, knowing he would be preparing for Sunday's sermon and unlikely to have interruptions. "Margaret," he said with surprise when I knocked on his open door. "This is a pleasant surprise. Please come in." His office was one of the spaces I had specifically requested during the building design phase, large enough for counseling sessions, with built-in bookshelves and natural lighting that would make difficult conversations feel less confrontational. I had imagined pastoral care happening in this room, not the conversation I was about to initiate. "Pastor Morrison, I need to formally request a special congregational meeting," I said, handing him the envelope. "The details are in this letter, including the specific concerns I need to address with the full membership." His expression shifted from pleasant confusion to worry as he scanned the letter. I watched his face change as he read phrases like, "significant deviation from founding mission," and questions regarding institutional transparency and accountability. "Margaret, these are serious allegations," he said, looking up from the pages. "Can we discuss this privately first? Maybe there's been some misunderstanding that we can resolve without involving the entire congregation." I had anticipated this response. "Pastor, I appreciate your desire to handle things quietly, but some issues require congregational oversight. The concerns I've outlined affect every member of this church, and they deserve to know what's being done in their name." He read through the letter again, more slowly this time. I had been careful not to reveal my identity as the anonymous donor, but I had outlined specific timeline discrepancies between the church's stated mission and its recent actions. Any careful reader would notice that my concerns were unusually detailed and well documented. Margaret, may I ask why you've chosen to take such a formal approach? We've always been able to discuss concerns openly here. I thought about all the times I had sat quietly in meetings while my contributions were ignored. All the moments I had watched decisions being made that contradicted everything I had funded this church to become. Pastor, when was the last time someone successfully challenged a board decision through informal discussion? When was the last time Richard Hamilton or Jennifer Walsh changed their minds because a longtime member raised concerns? The question hung between us like an uncomfortable truth. We both knew that the power dynamics in the church had shifted dramatically over the past year, and that informal conversations with traditional members carried far less weight than they once had. According to our bylaws, I continued, any member can request a special meeting if they believe the church's direction requires congregational review. That's what I'm doing. Pastor Morrison set the letter on his desk with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. The board will need to vote on scheduling this meeting. It's not automatic. Actually, it is automatic, I replied, pulling out a copy of the church constitution that David Chen had helped me review. According to Article 7, Section 3, any written request from a member in good standing must be honored within 30 days. The board can set the date and format, but they cannot refuse the meeting. His eyebrows rose slightly. I had clearly done more homework than he expected. Margaret, I have to ask, do you have legal counsel advising you on this? The question revealed his growing concern about where this was heading. I've consulted with someone about procedural requirements, yes. I want to make sure everything is handled properly. We sat in silence for a moment, the morning light streaming through windows I had paid to install, illuminating bookshelves I had funded, in an office that existed because of my sacrifice. The irony of having to formally request accountability from people who were stewards of my own gift was not lost on me. Can you give me any indication of what specific issues you plan to raise? Pastor Morrison asked carefully. The meeting will address discrepancies between our founding mission and current practices, questions about how our history is being represented to potential donors, and concerns about whether certain members are being marginalized in favor of a different demographic focus. Each phrase was carefully chosen to indicate the scope of my concerns without revealing the full extent of my knowledge. I wanted them to understand that this wasn't about minor policy disagreements. This was about fundamental questions of institutional integrity. Pastor Morrison rubbed his temples with the gesture of a man feeling the weight of competing pressures. Margaret, I hope you understand that this kind of meeting could be very divisive. We've worked hard to build unity and momentum over the past year. Pastor, I said gently, unity built on false premises isn't really unity, and momentum in the wrong direction isn't really progress. The words seemed to hit him with unexpected force. For a moment, I saw something in his expression that looked like recognition, as if he had been harboring similar doubts but hadn't known how to voice them. I'll present your request to the board at our meeting next Tuesday, he said finally. They'll need to set a date and determine the format. Thank you. I'll be expecting to hear from you by the end of next week. As I stood to leave, Pastor Morrison called after me. Margaret, whatever concerns you have, I hope you know that your voice matters here. You've been part of this community for years, and your perspective is valuable. I paused at the door, touched by what seemed like genuine sentiment despite the circumstances. Pastor, I hope the board remembers that when they're deciding how to respond to this request. The next week passed slowly. I continued attending Sunday service, sitting in my usual spot, observing everything with new awareness. The sermon was about building bridges and maintaining peace within the church community, clearly inspired by my meeting with Pastor Morrison. Several times during the service, I noticed board members glancing in my direction, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. After the service, Helen Rodriguez approached me with her characteristic directness. Margaret, dear, Pastor Morrison mentioned that someone has requested a special congregational meeting. Do you know anything about that? The question was asked innocently enough, but I could see that Helen was worried. Special meetings usually meant conflict, and she had lived through enough church splits to recognize the warning signs. I've heard about it, I said carefully. I think it's important for the congregation to discuss some concerns that have been raised about our direction. Helen nodded thoughtfully. I hope it's nothing too serious. This church has been such a blessing, especially this beautiful building. I'd hate to see anything threaten what we've built here. what we've built. The phrase stung because it was both true and false. Helen and the other longtime members had built a community based on genuine care and mutual support. I had built the physical structure that housed that community. But the current leadership was building something entirely different on that foundation. Helen, what do you think about some of the changes we've seen over the past year? I asked. Her expression grew more serious. Well, I have to admit, sometimes I feel like we're becoming something I don't quite recognize. All this talk about strategic planning and growth initiatives, it's very impressive, but it doesn't always feel like the church family I joined. What do you mean? Oh, little things mostly. The way some of the newer members seem to have so much influence so quickly. The way our outreach programs got cut, while we're spending money on marketing consultants. Sometimes I wonder if we're more interested in attracting the right kind of people than in serving whoever needs us. Helen's observations confirmed what I had been sensing. The changes weren't just visible to me. Longtime members throughout the congregation were feeling displaced and confused by the church's new direction. Friday afternoon, Pastor Morrison called. Margaret, the board has scheduled your requested meeting for next Sunday evening at 7 p.m. We'll use the fellowship hall, and we're inviting all members to attend. Will there be time for open discussion, or is this just an informational meeting? The board agreed to allow you 30 minutes to present your concerns, followed by a response period and general discussion. Richard Hamilton will facilitate the meeting. Richard Hamilton. Of course, they would choose the person most invested in the current direction to control the meeting format, but I had anticipated this possibility. Pastor, I need to let you know that my presentation will include some information that might be surprising to the congregation. I want to make sure everyone is prepared for a substantive discussion about the church's foundation and future. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Margaret, you're not planning to make any accusations against specific individuals, are you? I'm planning to share facts about our church's history that have been misrepresented. Whether people interpret those facts as accusations will depend on their role in creating the misrepresentations. Another pause. Should I be concerned about legal implications? Pastor, truth isn't a legal liability. Continuing to misrepresent that truth, however, might be. When we hung up, I felt the weight of what I was about to do. In 3 days, I would stand before the congregation and reveal not just my identity as their anonymous donor, but the gap between who they thought I was and who I actually am. I would force them to confront the difference between the story they had been telling about their success and the reality of how that success had been achieved. Some of them would be grateful for the truth. Some would be embarrassed by their assumptions. And some would be angry that their carefully constructed narrative was being challenged by the very person they had erased from it. But for the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not the invisible woman in the back pew, not the strategic investor of their imagination, but Margaret Thompson, the person who had loved them enough to give them everything, and who loved them enough now to demand they face the truth about what that gift actually meant. Sunday evening arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes everything feel significant. I arrived at the church 30 minutes early, carrying a leather portfolio that contained copies of every document I would need: trust agreements, donation receipts, construction contracts, and photographs of the original congregation in their cramped space above Patterson's Hardware. The fellowship hall was arranged like a town hall meeting, with rows of chairs facing a small table and microphone at the front. Richard Hamilton was testing the sound system while Jennifer Walsh arranged papers on the table with the efficiency of someone comfortable with controlling meetings. Pastor Morrison stood near the back, greeting people as they entered, his expression troubled but polite. I chose a seat in the third row, close enough to be clearly visible but not so close as to seem confrontational. As members filed in, I observed the same social patterns I had noticed developing over the past year. Newer members clustered near the front, their body language confident and proprietary. Longtime members scattered throughout the middle and back sections, many looking uncertain about what was to come. Helen Rodriguez sat 2 rows behind me, accompanied by Dorothy Chen and several other women who had been pillars of the congregation during the hardware store years. Tom Bradley took a seat near the back, his usual position during any gathering that might involve conflict. The Kowalski family had arranged for babysitting, a sacrifice on their tight budget that spoke to their concern about the church's direction. By 7 p.m., Nearly 80 people had gathered, the largest meeting in the church's history. Richard Hamilton called for attention and opened with a brief prayer, asking for wisdom and unity. Then he introduced the purpose of the meeting with the tone of someone managing a potentially volatile situation. "We're here tonight because Margaret Thompson has formally requested congregational time to address concerns about our church's direction," he began. "As a member in good standing, Margaret has the right to share her perspective, and we're committed to listening respectfully. Margaret, you have 30 minutes." I stood and walked to the front table, placing my portfolio beside the microphone. For a moment, I looked out at the faces before me, people I had worshipped with, served alongside, and cared about for over 2 years. Some looked curious, others concerned, a few openly skeptical about what the quiet bookkeeper from the back row could possibly have to say that required such formality. "Thank you for coming tonight," I began, my voice steady, despite the magnitude of what I was about to reveal. "I want to start by asking you to think back to a year ago, to the anniversary celebration we held last month. Remember the speeches about our mysterious anonymous donor, the person who supposedly recognized our strategic vision and decided to invest in our growth potential?" I paused, watching recognition dawn on some faces as they realized I was about to address the very narrative they had celebrated. "I'm here tonight to tell you who that donor actually was, why they actually gave, and how their story has been completely misrepresented to serve an agenda they never supported." The fellowship hall fell completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet as everyone strained to hear what was coming next. "My name is Margaret Thompson, and I am your anonymous donor." The silence shattered into gasps, whispers, and the scraping of chairs as people turned to look at neighbors, processing what they had just heard. Richard Hamilton's face went pale, while Jennifer Walsh sat frozen with her pen halfway to her notepad. Pastor Morrison closed his eyes briefly, as if he had suspected but hoped he was wrong. I waited for the initial shock to settle before continuing. 2.5 years ago, I started attending this church because I was lonely after my mother's death. I found a community of genuinely caring people who welcomed me without question. When you faced eviction from the hardware store space, I gave $180,000 to purchase the land on Maple Street because I loved the people you were and wanted to preserve the community that had become my only family. Helen Rodriguez had her hand over her mouth, tears starting in her eyes. Dorothy Chen was shaking her head slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. Over the following 18 months, I donated an additional $450,000 for construction, furnishing, and equipment. Every beam in this building, every pew you sit in, every window that lets in light, every door that welcomes people, all of it was paid for by a recently widowed bookkeeper who believed in the mission of serving others that this congregation embodied. I opened my portfolio and pulled out a photograph, holding it up for everyone to see. This is the congregation I fell in love with. 40 people meeting in a cramped space, struggling to pay rent, but still organizing food drives for the homeless shelter, still visiting elderly neighbors, still making sure every child had school supplies regardless of their family's financial situation. Murmurs rippled through the room as people recognized themselves in the photo, remembering who they used to be. "But that's not the story you told at the anniversary celebration, is it?" I continued, my voice gaining strength. "According to your speakers, I was a sophisticated business investor who conducted due diligence on your leadership team and decided to fund your strategic growth plan. You described me as someone who recognized your, quote, dynamic, forward-thinking vision and chose to invest in your measurable potential," Richard Hamilton tried to interrupt. "Margaret, I think there may have been some miscommunication about." "There was no miscommunication," I said firmly. "There was deliberate misrepresentation. You needed a story that justified cutting community outreach programs, excluding longtime members who didn't fit your demographic goals, and transforming this church into a revenue-generating business. So you invented a donor who supported those changes instead of acknowledging the real donor who funded this building specifically to prevent them." I pulled out copies of the original trust documents and held them up. These papers specify that my donations were intended to support a church dedicated to community service and inclusive worship. They include provisions that allow me to revoke the gift if the organization substantially deviates from its charitable mission. The room erupted. Jennifer Walsh shot to her feet. "Are you threatening to take back the building?" I'm explaining that you've been operating under false assumptions about your benefactor's intentions and identity. Every speech, every grant application, every fundraising appeal that references the anonymous donor's supposed endorsement of your current direction is factually incorrect and potentially fraudulent. Pastor Morrison stood slowly. Margaret, even if we made some incorrect assumptions about your motivations, surely we can work together to find a path forward that honors both your original intentions and our growth as a congregation. Pastor Morrison, growth isn't the problem. The problem is that you've grown away from everything I funded you to preserve. You've used my gift to become the opposite of what you were when I chose to support you. Helen Rodriguez raised her hand tentatively. Margaret, what do you want from us now? The question hung in the air, simple and direct. What did I want? I want the truth told about who gave you this building and why. I want the bronze plaque in the foyer to accurately reflect the donor's actual motivations, instead of fictional strategic thinking. I want the board to acknowledge that their leadership didn't inspire my donation. My donation enabled their leadership. And I want this congregation to decide whether they want to be the church I believed in or the business they've become. Richard Hamilton's face was red with frustration. Margaret, you can't just show up after 2 years and dictate how we run this church. We have responsibilities to our current members, our growth commitments, our financial obligations. Richard, I'm not dictating anything. I'm simply telling the truth about what you've been claiming credit for. Whether you choose to acknowledge that truth or continue living a lie is entirely up to you. I gathered my papers and stepped back from the microphone. You have 30 days to decide how you want to proceed. You can correct the public record, restore the community programs my donations were meant to support, and return to the inclusive mission that inspired my gift. Or you can continue operating under false pretenses, in which case I'll exercise my legal options to ensure this building serves the purpose it was actually intended for. The fellowship hall erupted into competing conversations as I walked back to my seat. Some people were angry, some were stunned. Others were already approaching Helen Rodriguez and Dorothy Chen with questions about what this meant for the future. As the chaos swirled around me, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not because I knew how this would end, but because for the first time since I had given my anonymous gift, everyone finally knew who Margaret Thompson really was. The quiet woman in the back pew had stepped into the light, and there was no going back to invisibility. Whatever happened next would happen with full knowledge of the truth, and that was all I had ever really wanted. The 30 days that followed my revelation transformed Millbrook Community Church in ways I never could have anticipated. The morning after the meeting, I woke to find 17 voicemails on my phone and 43 emails in my inbox. The responses ranged from Helen Rodriguez's tearful gratitude to Richard Hamilton's thinly veiled legal threats to Pastor Morrison's request for a private meeting to, quote, find common ground. But it was the email from Sarah Morrison that broke my heart and gave me hope simultaneously. Margaret, she wrote, I've been crying since last night, but not for the reasons you might think. I'm crying because for the first time in months I feel like someone understands what we lost. I've been mourning the church we used to be, and I didn't even realize it until you spoke the truth we all needed to hear. The congregation split into 3 distinct camps almost immediately. The Hamilton faction, as Helen Rodriguez dubbed them, circled the wagons around their strategic vision and began consulting lawyers about their options for maintaining control. The traditional members rallied around Dorothy Chen and Helen, finally having a voice for their months of quiet discomfort. And in the middle, Pastor Morrison found himself caught between competing loyalties and incompatible visions. By Thursday of that first week, things got interesting. Bradley Patterson, the young church administrator who had been so confident about growth metrics and revenue streams, submitted his resignation. His letter, which somehow found its way to every member of the congregation, was both apology and confession. I came to this position believing that business principles could enhance ministry, he wrote. I now realize I was trying to fix something that wasn't broken, and in the process, I helped break something that was beautiful. Mrs. Thompson's revelation has forced me to confront the gap between what we said we valued and what we actually pursued. I cannot in good conscience continue to advocate for strategies that contradict the very generosity that made them possible. Jennifer Walsh's response was swift and predictable. She called an emergency board meeting to discuss damage control and, quote, protecting the church's reputation. But when only 2 of the 7 board members showed up, it became clear that the power dynamics had shifted dramatically. Hema bote he her, p her. The second week brought unexpected developments. Tom Bradley, the veteran who had always sat quietly in the back, requested a meeting with Pastor Morrison and emerged as an unlikely leader in the movement to restore the church's original mission. "I've been in enough battles to recognize when someone's fighting for the right reasons," he told a gathering at Dorothy Chen's house. Margaret didn't have to reveal herself. She could have just walked away and let us figure out our mistakes on our own. The fact that she's still fighting for us tells me everything I need to know. Meanwhile, Richard Hamilton made a strategic error that sealed his fate. He contacted a local newspaper reporter, hoping to spin the story as a disgruntled donor trying to control a successful church. The resulting article, titled "Anonymous Donor Emerges After Church Dispute," included enough details about the financial contributions to make clear just how much one person had sacrificed for the congregation's benefit. The reporter, a skilled journalist named Maria Santos, had done her homework and painted a picture of institutional ingratitude that made the church leadership look petty and ungrateful. The article brought an unexpected wave of community support. Local business owners who had been considering donations to the church's building fund instead sent personal letters of thanks to me. The mayor, apparently embarrassed by her anniversary celebration comments, issued a public statement praising anonymous donors who gave, quote, without expectation of recognition or control. Most significantly, 3 other churches in the region reached out to invite me to speak about sacrificial giving and institutional stewardship. But it was what happened on the 19th day that changed everything permanently. I was working in my garden when Pastor Morrison appeared at my back gate, looking like a man who had been wrestling with angels. He was alone, which surprised me, and he was carrying a manila envelope that looked thick with documents. "Margaret," he said without preamble, "I owe you an apology that's going to take the rest of my ministry to fully express." I set down my pruning shears and invited him to sit on the back porch. He declined, apparently too agitated to sit still. "I've spent the last 3 weeks reading every board meeting minute from the past 2 years," he began. "I've reviewed every budget decision, every program cut, every policy change. And I've realized that I've been so focused on managing competing interests that I lost sight of our actual mission." He opened the envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. "This is my resignation letter to the board, along with my recommendation that the congregation vote to restructure the leadership entirely. But before I submit it, I wanted to ask you something." I waited, genuinely curious what he might ask. "Would you consider serving as board chair? Not as the donor, but as someone who remembers what we were supposed to be?" The question caught me completely off guard. I had imagined many possible outcomes of my revelation, but this wasn't one of them. "Pastor Morrison, I appreciate the gesture, but I don't think that's the answer. This congregation needs to choose its own direction, not have it imposed by the person who paid for the building." He nodded, but pressed on. "What if it wasn't about imposing direction? What if it was about protecting the foundation? You said yourself that you funded this building to preserve something valuable. Maybe that requires ongoing stewardship, not just a one-time gift." I thought about this for a long moment, watching the late afternoon light filter through the trees I had planted after my mother's death. Those trees were taller now, their roots deeper, their shade more meaningful because of the time they'd had to grow. "Let me ask you something, Pastor Morrison. If I accept that role, will you commit to rebuilding the programs we cut? Will you restore the community outreach that drew me here in the first place? Will you make it clear that this church exists to serve others, not to serve ourselves?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "and I'll do something else. I'll make sure that bronze plaque in the foyer tells the truth about why this building exists. Not as a monument to strategic vision, but as a testament to sacrificial love." The emergency congregational meeting was held the following Sunday. Richard Hamilton and Jennifer Walsh had resigned from the board by then, apparently unwilling to serve in an organization that rejected their vision of church growth. Several of their closest allies had quietly transferred their membership to other churches, claiming they needed more professional ministry environments. The vote was closer than I expected, but decisive. 73 members voted to accept Pastor Morrison's restructuring proposal and my appointment as board chair. 12 voted against, and several abstained. But it was enough to move forward. The real surprise came when Helen Rodriguez was elected as vice chair, and Tom Bradley was chosen as treasurer. The congregation had voted to put their future in the hands of the people who best remembered their past. 6 months later, the changes were visible everywhere. The community outreach budget had been restored and expanded. The homeless shelter food drive was bigger than ever, now coordinated through our commercial kitchen. The after-school program for neighborhood kids was meeting in our education wing every weekday. Sarah Morrison was back at the piano, leading a children's choir that included kids from families who couldn't afford music lessons anywhere else. The new bronze plaque in the foyer read simply, "This building was funded by the sacrificial gift of Margaret Thompson, a member of our congregation who believed that faith requires action, that love demands generosity, and that churches exist to serve their communities." May we never forget that the greatest gifts come not from strategic thinking, but from hearts that choose to give everything. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the smallest one. Every Sunday morning, I still sit in the third row from the back on the left side. But now, instead of being the invisible woman who funded their dreams, I'm the board chair who helps protect them. Instead of watching from the outside as my gift was misused, I'm working from the inside to ensure it serves its intended purpose. And sometimes, when I look around at the families worshiping in the space I provided, when I see teenagers from troubled homes finding safety in our youth programs, when I watch elderly neighbors receiving groceries from our food pantry, I remember why I gave everything in the first place. Not because I was a strategic investor looking for return on investment, not because I was impressed by their business plan or leadership potential, but because I was a lonely woman who found love in an unexpected place, and who discovered that the greatest way to preserve something beautiful is to give it everything you have. My name is Margaret Thompson. I built this church because I believed in what it was. I revealed myself because I refused to let it become something else. And I stayed because sometimes the most powerful act of faith is not the giving but the protecting of what you've given. The anonymous donor learned to speak her name, and in doing so she saved not just a building, but the soul of the community it was always meant to serve. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.